Hello, everyone. Welcome to Softly Spoken English. I'm Sophia, and I'm really happy you're here today. Maybe you're on your way to work, making yourself a cup of coffee, or simply taking a few quiet minutes for yourself. Wherever you are, thanks for spending this little part of your day with me. Today, I'd like to talk about something we've all experienced at least once. Those awkward moments when a conversation suddenly comes to a stop. You know the moment I'm talking about, right? Everything is going well, you're enjoying the conversation, and then silence. Nobody knows what to say next. It happens to everyone, and honestly, it doesn't mean you're bad at conversations. Most of the time, you just need a simple question or a natural response to keep things moving. That's exactly what we're going to explore together today. One thing I've learned over the years is that great conversations don't happen because someone always knows the perfect thing to say. They happen because people show genuine curiosity. When someone feels heard, they usually want to keep talking. And the good news is that you don't need complicated English to make that happen. Sometimes one simple sentence is more than enough. So today, I'd like to share 5 phrases that English speakers use all the time to keep conversations flowing naturally. They're simple, friendly, and incredibly useful. More importantly, they help the other person feel comfortable sharing a little more about themselves, and I think that's what makes a conversation enjoyable for everyone. Let's start with my favorite one. Really? Tell me more about that. I love this phrase because it works in so many different situations. Someone tells you about a trip, a new job, a hobby, or even something funny that happened during the day. Instead of changing the subject, you're inviting them to continue. And people usually appreciate that kind of attention. Imagine your coworker says, "I finally finished renovating my kitchen." You could simply say, "That's nice." But the conversation might end there. Now imagine saying, "Really? Tell me more about that. How did it turn out?" Can you feel the difference? Suddenly you've given the other person space to tell a story, and that's where conversations become interesting. Now, here's something I've noticed. Most people think a good conversation depends on having interesting stories to tell, but I don't think that's true. Some of the best conversations I've ever had were with people who simply knew how to listen. They asked small questions, paid attention to the answers, and made me feel like what I was saying actually mattered. That's a skill anyone can learn. Our second phrase is one I use quite often. What was that like? I love this question because it invites people to describe an experience instead of giving a short answer. Imagine someone says, "I moved to Australia last year." Instead of saying, "Oh, nice," you could ask, what was that like? Suddenly, the conversation becomes much richer and much more personal. The nice thing about this question is that it works almost everywhere. Someone talks about a new job, a holiday, learning to drive, becoming a parent, or trying something for the first time. What was that like? Encourages stories, and stories are what keep conversations alive. People usually enjoy talking about experiences much more than answering simple yes or no questions. Sometimes we worry so much about finding the next thing to say that we forget the other person probably has plenty to share. A good conversation isn't about speaking all the time. It's about helping the other person feel comfortable enough to keep talking. And often, one thoughtful question is all it takes to make that happen. Our third phrase is incredibly simple. And then what happened? This one is perfect whenever someone is already telling you a story. Instead of interrupting or changing the subject, you're gently encouraging them to continue. It's a small sentence, but it shows you're interested and curious about what comes next. And honestly, everyone enjoys talking to someone who listens with genuine attention. Imagine your friend says, "Yesterday, something really strange happened at work." They pause for a second, trying to remember the details. Instead of filling the silence, you smile and ask, "And then what happened?" It's almost impossible for the story to end there. You've opened the door for them to keep talking, and that's exactly what makes conversations feel so natural. You know what I find interesting? These phrases aren't clever because they're complicated. They're powerful because they make the other person feel heard, and that's something we all enjoy. When someone asks a thoughtful question instead of waiting for their turn to speak, the conversation immediately feels warmer. I think that's one of the simplest ways to become a better communicator in any language. Our fourth phrase is one that sounds very natural in English. How did that happen? I like this one because it shows genuine curiosity. Imagine someone says, "I ended up living in another country." That's a big statement. Instead of simply saying, "Wow," you could ask, "How did that happen?" You're inviting them to tell the story behind the story, and that's often the most interesting part. The beautiful thing about this question is that it isn't only about getting more information. It also tells the other person, "I'm interested in your experience." And people can usually feel the difference. You're not asking questions because you have to. You're asking because you're genuinely curious. That's what makes conversations feel easy instead of forced. I think we've all met someone who makes us feel comfortable talking. When you look back, it's rarely because they had amazing stories every time. More often, it's because they listened well. They smiled, asked simple questions, and gave us space to finish our thoughts. That's a communication skill that goes far beyond learning English. Our fifth and final phrase is probably the easiest one to start using today. "I've never thought about it that way." This is such a lovely response because it keeps the conversation moving while also showing respect for the other person's opinion. You don't have to agree with everything someone says to appreciate a different perspective, and this phrase expresses that beautifully. Imagine a friend shares an idea you've never considered before. Instead of changing the subject or simply saying, "Interesting," you could smile and say, "I've never thought about it that way." Most people naturally continue talking after hearing that. They feel encouraged to explain a little more, and that's exactly how meaningful conversations often grow. One thing I hope you remember after today's episode is that keeping a conversation going isn't about having the perfect words. It's about helping the other person feel comfortable enough to keep sharing. And the truth is, people usually remember how a conversation made them feel much more than the exact words that were said. Something else I've noticed is that we often put too much pressure on ourselves. We think we need to be funny, interesting, or incredibly confident all the time. But most conversations don't work that way. They're simply two people sharing small moments, asking questions, listening carefully, and enjoying each other's company. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. And here's something that might surprise you. If you pay attention to people who are really good at conversations, you'll probably notice that they don't actually talk the most. They listen. They ask thoughtful questions. They stay curious. That's what makes people enjoy being around them. And it's a skill you can practice every single day. So this week, I'd like to give you a small challenge. The next time you have a conversation in English, try using just one of today's phrases. That's all. Don't worry about using all 5. Choose the one that feels most natural to you and see what happens. You might be surprised by how differently the conversation unfolds. Even if you don't have many chances to speak English right now, you can still practice. Imagine a conversation while you're watching a movie. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, "What would I say next?" It's a simple exercise, but it helps you build confidence before you're in a real conversation. Little by little, those responses begin to feel more natural. And remember, becoming a good conversationalist doesn't happen overnight. It grows through small moments of curiosity, kindness, and practice. Every conversation teaches you something, whether it's with a close friend, a coworker, or someone you've just met. I think that's one of the nicest things about learning a language. It also teaches us how to connect with people. Let's imagine you're meeting someone for the first time. Maybe it's a new coworker or someone at a friend's birthday. They tell you they're originally from another city. Instead of simply saying, "Oh, that's nice," you could ask, "What do you miss the most about living there?" Questions like this usually lead to stories, memories, and much more interesting conversations than simple facts. I've noticed that people often remember good questions more than good answers. Think about the conversations you've enjoyed the most. Chances are, the other person made you feel comfortable talking about yourself. That's a wonderful skill to develop because it works in every language, not just English. Curiosity has a way of making conversations feel easy and natural. Here's another situation. Imagine a coworker says, "I'm taking a short trip this weekend." You could ask, "Have you been there before?" If they say yes, you might follow with, "What do you like about it?" If they say no, you could ask, "What made you choose that place?" One answer naturally leads to another question. One thing that helps conversations flow is staying connected to what the other person just said. Sometimes we think about our next sentence before they've even finished speaking. But when we really listen, the next question usually appears on its own. That's one of the reasons active listening is such an important communication skill. Let's say a friend tells you they recently started learning how to cook. Instead of saying, "That's cool," you could ask, "What's your favorite thing you've made so far?" It's a simple question, but it encourages them to think about a positive experience. Those kinds of questions often lead to longer and more enjoyable conversations. And here's something I really like. You don't need to remember dozens of different questions. If you learn a few that show genuine interest, you can use them in many different situations. The words might change a little, but the idea stays the same. You're inviting the other person to tell you a little more, and that's how conversations naturally keep moving. Now, let's think about conversations at work. Maybe you're having lunch with a coworker, and they mention they're taking a new course or learning a new skill. Instead of saying, "That's interesting," you could ask, "What made you decide to do that?" I like this question because it gives people the chance to share their motivations, and that's often where the conversation becomes much more personal. Sometimes we worry too much about asking the right question, but in my experience, people aren't looking for perfect questions. They're looking for genuine interest. If you're really listening, your curiosity usually shows. And when people feel that, they're much more likely to keep talking. That's one of those communication skills that becomes more valuable the more you practice it. Here's another situation you might recognize. Someone tells you they watched a movie over the weekend. Instead of asking, "Was it good?" you could ask, "What did you like about it? Do you notice the difference?" The first question can end with a simple yes. The second one almost invites a longer answer, and that's exactly what helps a conversation keep flowing. The same idea works with books, restaurants, holidays, hobbies, almost anything, really. Small changes in the way we ask questions can completely change the direction of a conversation. I think that's one of the reasons communication is so interesting. It's not always about knowing more words. Sometimes it's simply about choosing better questions. Another phrase I find really useful is, "What do you mean by that?" Some people worry that it sounds too direct, but when you say it with a friendly tone, it simply shows that you'd like to understand better. It also gives the other person the opportunity to explain their idea in a different way, which often leads to an even better conversation. And here's something worth remembering. Good conversations don't usually move in a straight line. They change direction. One story reminds someone of another story. One question leads to another topic. That's completely normal. In fact, that's often what makes a conversation feel relaxed instead of scripted. You don't have to control where it's going. Just enjoy where it takes you. I think many English learners believe they need a very large vocabulary before they can have enjoyable conversations. But honestly, I don't think that's true. I've met people with simple English who were wonderful to talk to because they were kind, curious, and willing to listen. Those qualities matter far more than using difficult words. So, if you're ever nervous before speaking English, try shifting your focus. Instead of thinking, I hope I don't make any mistakes, think, I hope I learn something about this person. It's a small change in mindset, but it can completely change the way a conversation feels for both of you. There's something else I'd like to mention because I think it happens to many English learners. Sometimes we're so focused on speaking correctly that we forget to enjoy the conversation itself. We start thinking about grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and suddenly we're no longer listening. If that has ever happened to you, you're definitely not alone. One thing that has helped me is remembering that conversations aren't performances. They're shared experiences. The other person isn't waiting for you to speak perfect English. They're simply hoping to connect with you. And once you realize that, a lot of the pressure begins to disappear. You become more relaxed, and your English usually becomes more natural too. I also think it's perfectly okay to take your time. We sometimes feel we need to answer immediately, but a short pause isn't a problem. Native speakers pause too. They think, they choose their words, they change their minds halfway through a sentence. That's part of normal communication, and it's something we often forget when we're learning a new language. Instead, try slowing down a little. Let the conversation breathe. If someone tells you they enjoy hiking, stay with that topic for a moment. Ask where they like to go. Ask how they got into it. Ask what they enjoy most about it. You don't need to jump to a completely different subject every 30 seconds. I've noticed that people often become more comfortable when they feel there's no rush. They don't have to give short answers because they know you're genuinely interested. Those are usually the conversations we remember later, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because they felt easy, relaxed, and enjoyable. And here's another small tip that can make a big difference. Try reacting to what people say before asking your next question. For example, if someone tells you they ran their first marathon, you could say, "Wow, that's impressive," and then ask, "How long did you train for it?" That little reaction makes your curiosity feel much more genuine. The same idea works in almost every situation. Someone tells you they got a promotion, adopted a puppy, finished a difficult project, or came back from a holiday. A simple reaction, followed by a thoughtful question, helps the conversation flow naturally. It's a small habit, but it can completely change the way people experience talking with you. Before we finish today, I'd like you to think about your last really enjoyable conversation. Maybe it happened with a close friend, a family member, or even someone you had just met. Chances are you don't remember every word that was said. What you probably remember is how that conversation made you feel. Comfortable, relaxed, interested. That's what good communication is really about. So the next time you're speaking English, don't put all your energy into finding the perfect sentence. Instead, focus on the person in front of you. Listen a little more carefully. Stay curious. Ask one more thoughtful question. I think you'll discover that conversations become much easier when your goal is to connect, rather than to impress. If today's episode gave you one new idea to try, then I'd call that a success. You don't need to change the way you communicate overnight. Small improvements have a way of growing over time. One good question today can become a natural habit tomorrow, and little by little, you'll feel more confident every time you speak English. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I always enjoy sharing these little conversations with you, and I hope you'll try one of these phrases the next time you have the chance to speak English. Until then, take good care of yourself. Keep enjoying the learning process, And remember that every conversation is another opportunity to grow.